Good morning. I hope you all had an interesting evening and maybe also afterwards a discussion after the town hall yesterday evening. I call now to order the informal interactive dialogue of the Assembly on accelerating the global energy transition, advancing renewables, energy efficiency, and international cooperation. I warmly welcome you and your speakers to this meeting. As outlined in my letter dated July 7th, 2026, this dialogue serves as an opportunity for member states to take stock of the progress in the energy transition, share best practices, and identify actions needed to accelerate implementation of already agreed global goals. And I welcome warmly representatives, experts, and heads of UN agencies in this field, but also long-standing friends and partners on the climate topic. So I'm very, very happy and delighted that we have Simon Steele, Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC with us today, Francesco La Camera, Director of IRENA, and Mr. Selwyn Hart, Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Climate Action and Just Transition. Thank you for joining us this morning. I now make a statement as the President of the General Assembly. The good thing about this morning is we don't have to explain very long why we are here. We all are here because we know that the climate crisis is one of the greatest threats of human security. And therefore, we decided by consensus as member states 10 years ago to counter it together by achieving global net zero greenhouse gas emissions, by scaling up renewable energy, and by ensuring energy access for all while supporting a just transition that advances the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. It seems like decades ago, it was only in 2015, and the good thing is that in between these years, so much has happened. However, we also all know that this shared aspiration has not yet resulted in the speed and coordination we need, and actually it could, given the modern forms of technology. Still, too much is done in silos. Too often, finance does not flow to where it must need it. In fact, I recall during my first days here as a President of the General Assembly, when I had the honor of receiving the Prime Minister of a small island developing state, which was facing the challenge in securing finance for large wind turbines. And she was saying, you know, we only need 5. We talked to so many other member states. Yeah, can you just organize the turbines? Because they would have simply ensured the whole energy and the whole electricity grid to be 100% renewable. But this lack of matching, I think, is what we have to address mostly, because the answers are all there, but the matching is missing. Because not there's really a lack of finance, but the failure to match with these projects and infrastructure investments for some countries are even that the projects are too little. So actually that you need too little finance to actually implement it or attract bigger investors. So much of this is because many of the most important financial discussions take place through separate, fragmented processes in which, for instance, 35 finance ministers working through the COP30 Circle of Finance Ministers under UNFCCC, last time in Belém, they meet, they agree on solution, but these discussions are not necessarily reflected then here again when we consider in these rooms the Sevilla commitments or when member states engage in DC separately with international finance institutions. And therefore, I'm grateful that today, as said, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, the Director General of IRENA, and the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Climate Action and Just Transition are here with us today, Your Excellencies and distinguished delegates, because we want to bring the topic of clean energy security to the heart of multilateralism and to increase the coordination across institution processes and centers of decision-making exactly here also at the General Assembly. And that principles that the topic of clean and accessible energy belongs at the heart of multilateralism runs through the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the obligations of states in respect of climate change, requested by this General Assembly through Resolution 77-276, in which the court affirmed that states have an obligation to cooperate continuously and meaningfully in addressing climate change. And we heard it also during the recent high-level political forum. Unless we bring our efforts together, we will not deliver the energy transition required to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And the UAE climate consensus translated that understanding into a clear global agenda: to triple renewable energy capacity, to double the global average annual rate of energy efficiency, to improve it by 2030. And to transition away from fossil fuels in energy system in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. And here's where the word equitable is crystal clear. Fairness is what will determine whether the transition in the spirit of the 2030 Agenda truly leaves no one behind. For without reliable access to energy and electricity, entire communities will be unable to do many things others take for granted: opening a bank account, renting a home, or benefiting from digital advances in health and education, let alone from AI. Without electricity, none of them will be possible in the future. Put simply, without delivering on the promise of the UAE climate consensus, we will not deliver on the 2030 Agenda. But the good news is that we already know what it needs to be done, including the investments in infrastructure, storage, and stronger grids. The challenge is the implementation. The challenge is the matching of finance with viable projects, like for the small island states who only need a couple of wind turbines. So our task is to learn from what works, adapt it to different national circumstances, and scale it up. Be it the frontrunners such as Kenya, where nearly 90% of electricity generation comes already from renewable energy sources, or Chile, where renewables are generated 2/3 of the country's electricity already in 2025, or the big cities like Buenos Aires, which led already in 2019 the transition from having the whole public street lighting network for energy-efficient LED technologies. And we all know these examples differ in geography and scale and national circumstances, but they all demonstrate that workable models already exist, provided we scale up finance. Unfortunately, for many countries, especially least developed countries, financing remains the biggest obstacle. And this is where international cooperation is so essential. And again, and this is sometimes where the citizens in our national context also do not understand politics anymore, and it's the same at international level. If people see that things are already working, also in the private sectors, then they really ask, so why is not the public sector capable of implementing it? And what we've seen, especially in the cooperation on finance, in my point of view, is incredible. Be it in Burkina Faso, where a concessional loan and reimbursable grant from Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa is already helping to finance an 80-megawatt solar power plant alongside other development financing, or as we just learned that in Ecuador, we are doing actually the debt for nature swaps, which we discussed for so many years for the debts for climate swaps, backed by private partners and helping to protect, in this case, the Galapagos and Amazon, and to drive climate action. This demonstrates that target public and concessional finance combined with multi-stakeholder cooperation among multilateral development banks, climate funds, international finance institutions, bilateral partners, and private investors can turn plans into projects and attract investments. And we have to ensure that our UN, that this place is the base for all of this. And for those who argue that we are facing headwinds in climate policy, obviously we do, we have all felt them, but we should only recall the time of 2015, when we saw the years before climate conference failure after failure. But then in Paris, the agreement was adopted, and many skeptics, even then after the adoption, argued that a transition to renewable energy would be completely unrealistic. I remember myself even mentioning phasing out of coal. I was almost expelled from politics, and this was only 10 years ago. And now many countries are showing how you can do a just transition of phasing out of fossil energy. And we have proven altogether the skeptics wrong. In 2025 alone, renewable energies accounted for over 85% of all new power capacities worldwide. This year, some $2.2 trillion is expected to flow into clean energy, almost twice the amount invested in fossil fuels. And these are not just investments in climate. We also know these are investments in peace and security, in energy security, and in resilient economies. For as recent crises on supply chains disrupted near the Strait of Hormuz, before in the Black Sea, demonstrated that dependence on volatile fossil fuel markets leaves countries vulnerable to shortages, geopolitical pressure, and sudden price shocks, as we have discussed extensively here in the General Assembly in February and in March. So I invite you to keep this in mind as we discussed over the next hours how we can scale up what is already working and deliver on the promise of the Paris Agreement and the UAE consensus for everyone. And if we don't want to call it climate security, then we call it energy security, or we call it protection of our peace. Because the peace agreement was adopted and the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, it's only mentioning not only security, but also justice, especially in the face of Africa. And I think it's important to remember, and those experts besides me know it probably the line and the paragraph. I had a bet in my old ministry where it was. Renewable energy was actually mentioned only once in 2015 in the two different documents. But it was only mentioned in relation to Africa and its urgent need of the continent for universal access to electricity. Yet today, and this is really something we have to address, we face a cynical situation that in the decades since, every region other than Africa has benefited far more extensively from the renewable energy transition. While China, the United States, and the European Union accounted for almost 80% of renewable energy capacity worldwide in 2025, Africa accounted for just 1.6%. So without a major expansion of renewable energy across Africa, we will not deliver sustainable development for the continent, but we will also not deliver on the promise we made 2015 in Paris. Nor will we be able to claim that global transition is just and equitable for all. So today, the core of our dialogue is to ask one concrete and practical question. How can we deliver on our promise and live up to our responsibilities, but not in theory, but with concrete practices? Where does it have a gap that, for example, with UNFCCC, discussions in Belém, and then coming up in Turkey, that there's a different discussions going on than the discussions we are having here? Or that at IRENA, you're saying we are doing all this, but unfortunately, we are not implementing it here in the General Assembly. Because we have to reach every region, we have to ensure that it works for every economy, and that it improves the lives of all the people it is meant to serve. In this regard, thank you for being here with us today.